introduce you to our moderator, Dr. Suzanne Minton, Director of Content Strategy at Certara. Dr. Minton has 9 years of corporate marketing experience with expertise in scientific content strategy and communication. Dr. Minton also spent 5 years conducting biomedical research on HIV and cancer. She holds a BS in biology from Duke University and a PhD in pharmacology from the School of Medicine at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Suzanne will moderate today's webcast with our speakers. Welcome, Suzanne.
Thank you so much, Robin, for that introduction. And thank you so much to RAPS for letting us present this webinar with you. So I'd like to introduce my colleagues who will be presenting a regulatory and strategic framework for facilitating pediatric drug development. Our first speaker will be Lynn Georgopoulos. Lynn is currently a Vice President of Regulatory Strategy at Certara. She has over 30 years of biopharmaceutical and CRO experience providing strategic, clinical development, and regulatory advice at all stages of product development. She's led numerous successful regulatory filings and regulatory interactions for pre-IND, INDs, NDA, EMA, and pre-NDA. Joining Lynn is Dr. Amy Chung, who's currently a Senior Director of Integrated Drug Development at Certara. Amy has over a decade of experience working in the pharmaceutical industry. Prior to coming to Certara, she worked at AstraZeneca as a Senior Pharmacometrician and Project Manager of the AstraZeneca Pediatric Working Group. She obtained her doctorate from the University of Manchester on the topic of structural identifiability analysis in Pkmpd models. She's also served as a chair of the IQ Consortium Clinical Pharmacology Leadership Group Pediatric Working Group, and she's a current co-chair of the IQ Consortium Pvpk Pediatric Group. Lastly, we have Jacqueline Binns joining us as a speaker. Jackie is currently an associate principal regulatory writer at Certara Synchrogenics. She has over 20 years of combined experience in the pharmaceutical industry, clinical diagnostic care and research, and medical writing. In her current role, Jackie routinely provides guidance on the regulatory strategy and clinical development across all stages of drug development and has led many successful regulatory submissions in the US and Europe across a variety of therapeutic areas. In addition, Jackie's held positions in drug discovery and development at Merck, as well as a clinical setting of the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia and the Hospital of the University of Pennsylvania. Jackie, Lynn, and Amy, welcome to today's presentation. I'll now hand it over to Lynn to get started.
Okay.
It's great, Lynn.
So the focus of today, and first of all, I would like to thank everyone for attending this webinar. And as we all know, pediatric drug development is quite complex. And certainly it's not possible to cover all of the issues in one webinar. So our goal today is really to highlight some of the key topics that you should be aware of when planning your pediatric development program. And so part of this webinar, we're hoping that as a takeaway that you'll become aware of the global regulatory framework and the requirements that are driving pediatric drug development, to become familiar with the principles of model-informed drug development, and to understand the principles for preparing a pediatric plan for submission to regulatory authorities. So over the last 20 years, initiatives and regulations have created a strong foundation to foster research and generate new treatment options for pediatric patients. Just in a bit of history on the origins of the pediatric regulations in the US, starting in 1994, the FDA began the first of several initiatives to enhance pediatric use information and drug labeling. The pediatric rule was intended really to promote the inclusion of pediatric information from either new clinical studies or previously published pediatric studies or case reports, really in an effort to provide pediatric dosing and monitoring information in the label. This was also the time when the FDA first formalized the concept of extrapolation, and Amy's going to talk about that, whereby a pediatric use statement could be based on adequate and well-controlled studies in adults, provided that the agency could conclude that the course of the disease and the drug's effects were sufficiently similar to permit extrapolation of efficacy from adults. And if needed, additional PK data and safety data would be generated to determine appropriate and safe pediatric dose. Unfortunately, the pediatric rule did not substantially increase the number of products with adequate pediatric labeling. So it wasn't until the introduction of the Best Pharmaceuticals for Children Act in 2002 and the companion legislation, the Pediatric Research Equity Act, or PREA, in 2003, did the US really begin to see real momentum for change. These regulations were updated in 2007, 2012, and most recently in 2017, when PREA was amended with the Race for Children's Act. This was an important amendment that closed a legislative gap that had exempted cancer drugs with orphan designation from mandatory pediatric requirements under PREA. This amendment also allowed for more close alignment with the EU pediatric regulations that focused on a condition versus indication, and I'll talk about that in a moment. So whereas in the US pediatric legislation consists of these two separate acts, Pvpk and PREA-FDARA, the EU has one single unified pediatric regulation that was introduced in 2007, which was heavily inspired by the US regulations. And up to this point, the regulation basically has remained unchanged. I've heard that EMA is planning to amend the pediatric regulation as well as the orphan regulation, which are currently under review, with the goal to release these revised drafts for public comment at the end of 2022. We are hopeful that they will be able to provide some flexibility around when during the drug development process, the PIP, the Pediatric Investigation Plan, must be submitted, as currently it is very early in development. And we'll talk about that in a moment. Just to finish out, Switzerland also mandates pediatric drug development, which is based on the EU framework, and the UK, of course, following Brexit, also mandates pediatric drug development that also follows the EU framework. To improve consistency, collaboration, and communication on pediatric trial designs and approaches to pediatric drug development, the FDA, along with EMA, has established the Pediatric Cluster. The purpose of the Pediatric Cluster is to really look for opportunities to harmonize standards and develop systematic approaches to support pediatric drug development. So they meet monthly, and at these meetings, they really discuss these key issues, such as use of modeling and simulation to support pediatric development. And that is one particular big area that is under discussion. Representatives, in addition to representatives from obviously FDA and EMA, there is representatives from Japan, Pharmaceutical and Medicines Device Agency, PMDA, Health Canada, and Australia's Therapeutic Goods Administration. Also take part in these conferences, although these countries currently do not mandate pediatric research. And I'm going to touch upon some of the incentive programs that they actually do have in place when you start to think about your global program. The Pediatric Cluster issues what's called common commentaries, which allows regulators to communicate informal, non-binding, collaborative comments to drug developers on pediatric development plans. They don't always agree, but really try to reach some level of commonality. Some of the common commentaries are made public, like the most recent common commentary on submitting pediatric plans for the prevention and treatment of COVID-19. The cluster also shares now high-level action items with the sponsors of products following discussion at the Pediatric Cluster. So if you submit your pediatric plan to both the US and EU, those plans can be discussed if so elected at the Pediatric Cluster. And really the objective is to let sponsors know that their product was discussed and what some of those agreed action items. So there is feedback. One other important topic to mention regarding the cluster surrounds pediatric cancer drug development. So given the global nature of cancer drug development, as it is a relatively rare in childhood, which really impacts study populations globally for clinical trials, and the demand for international collaboration has intensified, both EMA and FDA really will support these programs and provide consolidated recommendations for the PIPs and PSPs for new cancer products. Again, if they are submitted in parallel. So that is a recommendation from the agencies that is done. And then I'll also just briefly talk about parallel scientific advice a little bit later in my talk. So as you can see here, that the regulations are working. I did a quick check of the status of approved pediatric labels through just June 2020, and we now have just over 900 labels that have been updated with pediatric use information, which is great. As you can see, there's sort of a mix of the approval types. So BPCA, those labels updated with PREA, and then a combination of both PREA products that actually followed both the regulations under BPCA as well as PREA. And I will say that although we're making significant progress there, what we're finding still is that there is significant lag time between approvals in adults, which is really the traditional path that most companies will take, is to develop drugs initially in adults and then move into the pediatric space. You know, and this can sometimes be up to about 9 years, depending upon the particular indication. So it's really essential that we continue to pursue creative solutions, such as model-informed drug development, to facilitate more informed and expeditious pediatric drug development. So on this slide, I've highlighted some of the key elements of the pediatric regulations in the US and EU. And as previously mentioned, you know, there are 2 regulations, PREA and BPCA in the US, and then 1 single regulation in the EU. So PREA is the mandatory program. Every product development program, even if it's a pediatric only program, must consider whether PREA applies or not. So PREA is limited to the indication that will be under review of the NDA and BLA. Okay, so that's an important distinction when we start to think about the regulations in the EU. So any applications for a new active ingredient, a new indication, new dosage form, a new dosing regimen, or a new route of administration are subject to PREA. Biosimilars that are not deemed interchangeable are also subject to PREA, and an IPSP must be filed. And this is applicable, just wanted to mention, sometimes we forget about over-the-counter products, but it is applicable to OTC products as well. So products with orphan designation in general are exempt from the requirements of PREA, with the exception of products intended to treat adult cancers. So, and that's even if the product has orphan designation. So this only applies, so the requirements under FDARA only applies for the first new NDA or BLA for a new active ingredient, okay? So for instance, if the adult indication was multiple myeloma, which also happens to be on the automatic waiver list in the US that FDA publishes, since the compound, for instance, targets a BRAF gene abnormality, that is considered relevant to the pediatric brain tumors, which is on the targeted list for pediatrics. And so the sponsor would be required to do an initial investigation to see if the product is relevant to the treatment of pediatric brain tumors. So that's just an example. So FDA, I just wanted to mention, FDA has published a waiver list for indications that they consider not relevant to pediatrics. However, you still need to file an IPSP to notify FDA at the time of filing your NDA or BLA that you plan to request a waiver from conducting a pediatric assessment. So note that in the on the IPSP, the mechanism for communication to the agency is this IPSP. Jackie will cover the content of the IPSP as well as the PIP later in the webinar, but I wanted just to point out that really the IPSP is the mechanism that you communicate your plan. So FDA, just so everyone's aware, does not grant agreement for a waiver or deferral, which is really the process which allows you to not have to submit that pediatric data with your NDA or BLA, but rather it's the agency will acknowledge that that's your plan. So the actual agreement on whether or not they agree to a deferral or waiver is really done at the time of the NDA or BLA is approved. And you'll see a final statement in your approval letter as to the agreement with the waiver and deferral process, and then what those studies will be as far as post-marketing requirements. So under PRIA, there is no financial incentives, okay? So if a company wishes to get that additional 6 months of exclusivity, marketing exclusivity, they must file also what's called a proposed pediatric study request. And this is very similar to the content that you would have in an IPSP, okay? In order for then FDA to issue a written request, which outlines all the studies and the timeframes that you must meet in order to actually be granted that additional exclusivity. And we'll talk about that a bit further. So again, 2 programs, the only way to get financial incentive is if you actually commit to both PRIA and BPCA. Now, also, I should mention that you may get a waiver under PRIA, so you're exempt, but you can still file again through this proposed pediatric study request process in order to then get the written request under BPCA. So under the EU regulations, the scope of the PIP is based on the condition and not indication. And so this is an important distinction between the US and EU, because for the EU, the Pediatric Committee, or PECO, may request development for an indication not pursued in adults, yet still part of the overall condition. And there's a policy that is written that will describe that EMA has issued on the scope of the PIP, okay? This is where PRIA now becomes more aligned with the amendment of FDARA because the scope of the IPSP for products that qualify under FDARA are not limited to the adult indication, but really are driven by the relevant molecular target, okay? So again, the scope applies to, in Europe, in the EU, the scope for a PIP applies to new medicinal products, rather, regardless of the registrational pathway, and products that also have their SPC in place. And so there's an additional mechanism of the pediatric use marketing authorizations for those products that are no longer covered by the by an SPC, but the process is the same. They utilize the tool of the pediatric investigational plan, and the tool in the US is the IPSP. Okay. So, we all know that, we have the regulations in place, but really what I find them of most value is all of the guidance documents that have been published to support pediatric drug development. So even before the regulations went into place, there was guidances that were published, the E11 on clinical investigations for medicinal products in the pediatric population. And since then, a number of guidances, and I've just listed here some of the key guidance documents that you should be aware of when you're thinking about your for pediatric planning purposes. There are others that can help to support your plan. So the Ich E11 has been amended since 2000. There's also a recent guidance that was issued on the non-clinical safety testing to support pediatric drug development. And then most recently, the E11A on the utilization of pediatric extrapolation. And again, these are applicable to both the US and EU. So they basically are jointly have reviewed these under ICH. But again, other countries that also follow ICH and that have elected to follow these, that is applicable to them as well. So on this slide, this is really just to be able to show that both FDA and EMA have acknowledged the importance of model-informed drug development to support pediatrics. And that is why, as part of this webinar, we have included a session on model-informed drug development that Amy will be presenting. Here, I just wanted to bring up 2 additional guidance documents just to make you aware. And these two are, I find, two of the more essential documents, which is the general clinical pharmacology considerations for neonatal studies, as well as just overall guidance for pediatric drug development. And both of these guidances address ethical considerations, which we don't have a singular policy put out by the FDA on ethical considerations. You know, we have it specified within the context of the regulations. Europe does have a policy on ethical conduct of studies in pediatrics, but really this helps to outline some of those expectations for minimal risk and at what point you actually will begin consideration for pediatric studies in context of adult development, if in fact, you know, the indication is relevant to adults as well. But really, this also outlines the clinical pharmacology considerations and then also early pediatric study design and planning considerations. So would highly recommend that if you are involved in pediatric drug development, that you actually take a real look at these two guidance documents in particular. Just to be aware that the presentations will be available after the webinar, and we have embedded links to all of these documents just for ease of use. Okay. So I just wanted to touch briefly on, because we're talking about it, this webinar in terms of global product development, that you're aware of some of the other kind of main regions and what is available. So as I mentioned, Japan's part of the cluster. They don't have, they're not requiring pediatric drug development, but actually are involved in these meetings, and really there are they have committed to supporting pediatric development, and so they actually have some mechanisms and frameworks in place, and some incentives as well. So they've extended re-examination periods for pediatric drugs. They encourage inclusion of adolescents with adult studies, and they have formalized sort of some pediatric clinical trial networks. China as well, and I mention this because they're going through a change where they have now acknowledged that pediatric drug development has not been a focus, and so there are efforts that have now been in place to encourage research and development in the area of pediatrics. And so they've issued some technical guidelines, et cetera, for supporting pediatric development. And so they're really, again, they also have a mechanism for priority review in China as well. And again, there's some links to these that I put in here so that you can look at this in a little bit more detail. So the other two areas that I wanted to mention, again, because they're part of the cluster, is Canada and Australia. Again, they do have incentive plans in place. They do follow the relevant ICH guidelines. And they also want to be communicated. So if you do have an agreed PIP or IPSP in Europe and the US, they want that information to be submitted with the marketing applications, and in particular in Australia, and they actually call that out. And Australia just also has some, does have mandatory text requirements for pediatric use statements within their labels now. Again, because they don't require pediatric development, you don't have to submit the information, but you do have to address the section within the context of the label in Australia. Okay. So on this slide, I just really wanted to point out, and Jack is going to go into a bit more detail on the cycle of the PIPs and PSPs, but really to talk about here at what point, as I mentioned, it's early in development that the PIP and the IPSP gets submitted. So the PIP, by regulation, is really required that it's submitted right after completion of phase 1 studies, which is really quite early. And many companies really don't have a firm idea as to really where their product development path is going to go at that point. But by the regulations, they do want a PIP to be submitted very early in the process. And we're hoping, again, with some of the changes that are going to be occurring in the European regulations, whether or not they'll actually have add a little bit more flexibility to when the PIPs are submitted. But there is an expectation that it certainly is going to be submitted before the initiation or in parallel with the initiation of phase 2 studies. And Jackie will kind of point out that you actually have to put in the date like when you completed your phase 1 studies so that they can evaluate compliance with timing of submitting for that. So at any rate, you can see where there is a difference between when the IPSP must be submitted within the context for the US, which is traditionally after the end of phase 2 meeting. So by law, you must submit your IPSP within 60 days after the end of phase 2. Some, depending upon your development program, some will not have an end of phase 2. They might have an end of phase 1, where then they're going to go right into registrational trial work. So you must submit the IPSP and be prepared to do that before the initiation of studies, registrational trials, okay? And again, you must have agreed plans in place in order to submit a marketing application in Europe, in the EU rather, as well as in the US. Okay. So let's see here. All right. To the next one here. I wanted to just briefly talk about the EU scientific advice and protocol assistance in relationship to pediatric drug development. So if you, again, are going to be planning to seek advice on other topics, it's advisable that you actually include within the request for scientific advice or protocol assistance questions about pediatric development, if possible, and just to be aware that advice, anything related to pediatrics, is free, so there's no charge for that within EU. Certainly, it's a good chance to get to really understand what the agency's thinking on pediatric development in the context of your overall development program to get that information. For FDA, I did want to point out one specific early meeting, which is the for pediatric oncology product development. So that early advice meeting, which is called the Type F meeting. And so you're able to meet and receive feedback from FDA within 30 days of submitting your meeting package and request. And this meeting is really more of a consultation with the agency on your thinking for pediatric oncology, which is difficult when you look in the context of your adult program and the fact that you may not have done any work specifically in pediatrics, but because of the requirements under FDARA, you're now having to think about pediatric drug development in the context of your adult program. Again, different indications, it's really targeted. And so this really is an opportunity, and I have been involved in a few of these and really do recommend that you consider, if you are working in the area of oncology, to really seek this, take advantage of this early advice meeting. Even though the recommendations are non-binding, but at least again, you get some early feedback. And really, I think that it really facilitates a more efficient discussion, even if you're then considering submitting a proposed pediatric study request with the hopes of getting a written request for your program. The other advice meeting I wanted to talk about is in the context of parallel scientific advice. The FDA is really, and both FDA and EMA are really encouraging this parallel review. And it's a mechanism where both EMA and FDA can concurrently exchange their views on your pediatric development plan. It is applicable to drugs only, although device components it's not an automatic denial, so you can have drug device combination. It is a single request for this parallel scientific advice. It basically follows the format for the EMA scientific advice template. You'll just submit and notify both FDA and EMA of your intent for this parallel advice. And what they've reported is that really the average time from meeting package to validation, which means to getting advice, is around 79 days. So although there's been this sort of misconception that parallel advice is actually taking longer, in fact, it's roughly around the same time frame as seeking advice for scientific advice from EMA. And then you can actually ask specific questions that are suitable for each for each agency. So you may have common questions, but then also some questions specific to EU or FDA. And again, I've given some examples here with what you can discuss. Okay. So I wanted to talk just about some other specific programs within the US that I started to mention, which was the proposed pediatric study request and where that fits in with the written response. So as I mentioned, this is the link between PRE and BPCA to secure that additional exclusivity. And so what happens is after you submit a PPSR, and this can occur throughout development, but it has to be done before you actually file, that FDA will either issue a response to your request, either in the form of the written request or a letter outlining any deficiencies. So I just thought it'd be helpful to kind of understand, what the response rate is on these PPSRs. And so implementation of FDARA, they received 170, FDA's reported, it was a report to Congress, they've received 170 PPSR requests. The mean time from receipt to initial response was about 110 days. FDA responded to 147 of those within 120 days. And the number that have been reviewed was compared to the number of written requests rather, is much smaller than the number of PPSRs requested. And they believe that that's really what really happens in with the written request is that you may submit your PPSR with a very specific scope, and FDA, because they have under this program, can expand what's required for you to evaluate for pediatrics can be outside of the scope that you intended. So companies then will either withdraw or opt to not follow the written request because again, their intent was to have it more narrowly focused, but FDA expanded that out. So that is something to be aware of when it comes to the PPSR, that it can be expanded farther outside of what your original intention for, again, of the pediatric program that you were going to embark on. So wanted to talk specifically also about the rare pediatric disease designation. This is a separate process from the orphan drug designation process, similar in content to the ODD, but it is a separate process. And it involves diseases that are serious or life-threatening that primarily affect individuals from birth to 18 years of age. It doesn't mean that you can't get a rare pediatric disease designation if it also occurs in adults, but it primarily manifests in children. So for this program, you must have the rare pediatric disease designation request. You must have received a designation if you wanted to also be considered for qualifying for a rare pediatric disease priority review voucher. Okay, so typically, if you're going to make this submission, it's done at the same time of either fast track designation or requesting orphan drug designation. And there is some cross-referencing that can be done to your ODD application, but there are some very specific focused questions in order to qualify for the rare pediatric disease designation. And then what happens is when you get a response, you'll also be told whether or not there is potential for you to qualify to receive a rare pediatric disease priority review voucher, and that will also be explained in the response letter that you receive. Just the last thing to talk about for the rare pediatric disease priority review voucher program. So currently, Congress did extend for a 4-year period as part of the Coronavirus Response and Relief Supplemental Consolidation Act of 2021. So after September 30th, 2024, FDA may only award a voucher to sponsors that have rare pediatric disease designation that has been obtained by September 30th of 2024. And after this point, the latest that vouchers will be issued currently is 2026. And it is, that's the current status for where the priority review voucher stands. And I did again highlight some guidance where you can obtain some additional information. So just really wanted here to kind of just summarize the approach from my viewpoint in pediatric drug development. And again, this is very high level, but you've got your target pediatric condition indication. Again, we're going to talk, you're going to address bridging knowledge from adults to pediatrics in the form of extrapolation. The one thing a couple of areas I didn't touch on in detail, which is the need for an appropriate pediatric formulation. So there are requirements that companies who are developing products, in particular orally administered products, there's a bit more challenges there, but they must have considerations for pediatric formulation development. And there's actually some AMAT guidance around that. The US currently does not have a guidance specific to formulations, but reference to those formulation requirements are actually in those two key guidances that I mentioned earlier in the presentation for clinical pharmacology considerations. There's also a weighted evidence approach to the non-clinical safety testing plan that you must have within the context of your pediatric plans, a plan for non-clinical safety testing and whether it's required or you can justify not doing this through this weighted evidence approach. So that's part of your overall plan. And again, reaching alignment between the US and EU on that. And really, as part of the overall plan is determine what and if the regulations are applicable to your program. And then what other available programs so that you can take advantage as a regulatory representative, what other programs can help to foster, other, as I said, kind of value added programs such as the potential for qualifying for a pediatric voucher or additional designation requests. It's important to examine the precedents that are available, and should be aware that PIP decisions are made publicly available. IPSP decisions are not. Again, mentioned about the common commentary. That's a great resource. There is one specific on for pediatric oncology that's been issued. And then any other guidance documents and resources that really are available to help you inform on your overall pediatric development strategy. So with that, I will turn over to Amy, that's going to talk about the principles of model-informed drug development to enhance pediatric development.
Thank you so much, Lynn, for all the great information. And as Lynn said, we want to include these sections to allow you to have consideration of the types of quantitative approach from pediatric, and so you would aware of what example is out there. Next slide. So before we start, we think it's really good to give you some definitions. Pharmacokinetic is very important to know that describe the absorption, distribution, metabolism, extractions, allow us to understand what the drug is actually going around the body. It usually will use pharmacokinetic to understand like dose and schedule, drug-drug interaction, food interactions, etc. And for pharmacodynamic, it's actually what the drugs do to the body. Pharmacodynamic to be biomarker response or safety or efficacy response. And even like the temperature, if you think about paracetamols in patients as well. Next slide. And we want to also include some definitions because you will see different of them for MIDD and MID3. They're basically pointing to the same thing, is around the description of a framework. It's for giving you the right tools, asking the right questions, and then be able to use the adequate model and then identify whether the data is available or you need to design the sufficient trial. Then pulling all this together as a modeled approach for prediction, extrapolation, and specifically optimizing trial and dose in different subpopulation. And then in the interest of this talk will be pediatric. And ontology we are referring here is the development of different organisms. So we can use ontology and maturation interchangeable in here. Next slide. So this slide I want to just point out to you why Pkmpd is needed to be considered, because the main risk of if we don't understand the PK and PD sufficiently, we might be under or overexposed exposures to the patient, and subsequently that will link to safety or safety concern or inadequate in the efficacy threshold that we need. And we also include a different bullet point outline why we need to have a special focus on pediatric, because pediatric is not small adult. There are differences in size and maturation process governed in a development. And also there are different disease progressions because of the age as well. And quite often because it's a vulnerable population, so the data that we've obtained from the pediatric trial are often sparse. So how can we utilize the data from pediatric and also learn from our experience from adults or other class of drugs that might be beneficial to the compound that of interest that you're developing as well. Next slide. So previously in the last slide, we talked about PD very focused on biomarkers and efficacy, but PD can also representing on safety. So a term that is very important to note is the therapeutic index. So this is a ratio comparing the concentration where a drug is effective and a concentration when a drug is toxic. So the larger the therapeutic index, that means the safe of the drug, but then very narrow therapeutic index, that means we need to select that optimizing dose that results in a concentration is quite tight. And some examples in the literature and in labeling that you can find are warfarin. These drugs have already with quite tight therapeutic index in adults, so for pediatric is even more tight. But the idea of having a model approach to look at it is we can balance this risk benefit therapeutic index for each of the candidate compounds that we're developing. Next slide. So there are different opportunity in a pediatric study where we can apply modern simulations. For example, the volume of the blood sampling is often a concern, and there is blood limitations, especially in really young, like neonates. So we can use modern simulations for optimal sampling and also sample size calculations. And as Lynn mentions, there is encouragement to use extrapolations based on existing adult data reference populations. And also we can use a model to actually justify whether the exposures is comparable if we dosing the drug in milligram per kg, or we can use like a fixed dose dosing that might be more easy for dosing purposes. That is all the different types of usage that modeling simulation can be used. And we'll introduce other specific modeling types in some example. Next slide. So as Lynn mentioned, we often need to consider age-appropriate formulation, and this is a table extracted from EMA reflection paper that can more details of different types of route and formulations that's suitable for different age of pediatrics. And often with modeling and simulations, we can also testing the similarity between the formulation to ensure the newly age-appropriate formulation developed in pediatric will be similar to those one that's in adult in terms of exposure, safety, and efficacy as well. Next slide. This is extractions from the Ich E11 R1 update to emphasize the benefit and opportunity to use modern simulations. And you can see on the right is the content, and then we really strongly encourage you to look at both the Ich E11A and the E11A R1 to look at it for more details. Next slide. And this slide just again highlight the different industry regulatory initiative, and then to support modeled informed drug development in pediatrics. And again, this is many really good references material that you can look at, and they were multiple workshops that looking at, for example, dose finding that you can see in the bottom left corners. There's a lot of material still available in the AMA website and recording that you should take a look of that. Next slide. So the model-informed drug development, we have written a white paper a few years ago in 2016, which highlight the importance to have a framework to apply best practice. How can we utilize different data to support different drug development, different phases and different subpopulations? And I included the applications and definition for pediatrics in here. And this paper was a good collaboration between industrial partners and also with involvement from our regulatory members that advising what is needed and the gap. And you can listen to the podcast of the paper and also read the paper and also the supplement in this to link here. And next slide. So I won't go into details, but just want to outline that in this paper, it really outlines why MIDD is important and what is MIDD about and how do we implement it. So this will be a really good references as a starting point to learn about everything about MIDD and for your clinical team and also preclinical team working with you together when you're preparing the pediatric strategy. Next slide. So the whole idea of the pediatric development and also MIDD is the learning and confirming that we continuously learning as we got new data, and then we have different tools to allow us to confirm is our hypothesis that we test in the new populations is correct. And this is very important, especially when we're doing extrapolation, where we are trying to use modern simulations to replace part of or the actual clinical trial based on the data we have. Next slide. So I'm not going to go through details of the different tools, but then in the paper, you will see outline of the key is to asking what is the right questions, because we need the right question to drive what types of modeling and simulation and what types of data we want to generate it from the future trial and what types of gaps that is already in the trial. And then we need to look at the assumptions. The assumption can be the things that we don't understand, or the assumption about the disease or about the population or about the similarity between adults and pediatrics. They're all the different types of assumption we need to consider. And then based on this, and then we can decide what types of model and simulation approach that can answer those questions. Next slide. So there are 8 examples out of 100 examples in this paper that are pediatrics. Strongly recommend you to take a look at it, and each of them produce different impacts on different development phases. Next slide. This is an example of the key question that you can ask at different level. For PK, I outlined some example at the disease, compound, additional mechanism level. I think this is really important that in each of the product team would need to identify this type of question. What will we trying to get there? Because this is also the questions the regulator will ask you as well. Next slide. And this, just to outline a little bit more the different types of modeling from very simple empirical approach to mechanistic approach, but the main consideration is really on the objective, what kind of data is available, what is the usage of the work, and you can see the different consideration in the box on the right. Next slide. And I outlined this example, but then there's a lot of information and we might not have enough time to talk about it today. And this is an example that also outlined in the MID3 paper and also with the reference below. It's on a drug called rivaroxaban, which is to treat venous thromboembolism in pediatric population. And the whole idea is how can we use the adult information and incorporate it into model and therefore predicting the pediatric starting dose and also supporting on the dose optimizations. And the next slide, it showed you how in a paper, and in this slide, I'll show you how we can incorporate in vitro and also clinical trial data into the physiological pace, pharmacokinetic models on the right in here. So this type of model can be built in-house, or there are different commercial platform available, such as Pkmpd that you can use to carry out this kind of modeling. And next slide. And this provides a workflow of the steps of how to build a Pvpk model from adult and validated to use in pediatric and subsequently used for predictions for pediatric trial. And next slide. And then this is just showing some validation and details you can see in the references in below. Next one. So as Lynn mentioned, we have been increasing the consideration of extrapolation, and there is a nice poster on the right from IQ Consortium to look specifically on extrapolations on different diseases. And the good news is ICH have now drafted a guidance for extrapolations in pediatrics, which you can see online. And then we really strongly encourage people, if the information is available and the disease is similar, then we should always attempt to have an extrapolation consideration when you're planning for your PIP and PSP and pediatric strategy. And next slide. And finally, we should always try to remember for vulnerable populations such as oncology and rare cancer, model simulation also very useful, because it would allow us to utilize all the data, especially when our sample size is really small. And there are some references in here that you can take a look. And thank you so much. And now I want to pass to Jackie for the next part.
Thank you, Amy. Appreciate your time. Next slide, please. As mentioned by Lynn and Amy, there are many factors to take into consideration when developing a pediatric plan. Most of the information to be included in the PIP and IPSC will be similar, including background on the disease, product information, the extrapolation plan, pediatric formulation plan, the toxicology plan, the proposed clinical studies plan, the plan for waivers and deferrals, as well as a description of agreement from other agencies as applicable, and the overall pediatric development timelines. Next slide, please. This is a schematic comparing the content of each application. Kindly note that the FDA provides a general outline to be used, but the EMA provides a Word template document with guidance checks that must be used when drafting the pediatric plan. All of the templates and forms are available on the FDA and EMA sites, respectively. Next slide, please. This is a continuation of the content outline for both documents, showing the similarities of the content to be included within each. Note that there are unique requirements for a PIP, including additional forms that are required, such as the application form and the key elements form, both of which must be submitted along with the PIP. In the submission of an IPSP for pediatric oncology indications, there are also additional requirements, which I will provide further detail on in the following slides. Next slide, please. So for IPSPs for oncology indications, early pediatric evaluation of certain molecularly targeted oncology drugs, as required by Section 505(b)(a)(1)(b) of the Best Pharmaceutical for Children's Act, it's expected to accelerate the creation of pediatric development plan and ultimately the development of drugs for pediatric patients. Prior to this amendment, the pediatric study plans for oncology drugs were generally proposals to request waivers for pediatric studies, as the adult cancer indications for which the drug was developed often did not occur or occurred, only rarely in pediatric patients, making the pediatric studies and those indications nearly impossible or impractical. Under the provisions of PREA, it's required that certain oncology drugs for adult cancer indications to be studied based on the molecular mechanism of action of the investigational drug rather than the clinical indication. Therefore, this amendment requires that any original NDA or BLA for a new active ingredient submitted after August 18th, 2020 must include reports on these molecularly targeted pediatric cancer investigations if the drug is subject to the application is one, intended for the treatment of an adult cancer, or if it is directed at a molecular target that is determined to be substantially relevant to the growth or progression of a pediatric cancer. And there, I do have some content differences listed here between general IPFP as well as Certara IPFP. Next slide, please. For PIP submissions, an application form and a key elements form must be included, as I mentioned previously. The application form must include both the date of completion for the adult pediatric PK study, or excuse me, the adult PK study, typically the phase 1 first-in-human studies. If the date included is later than 6 months from completion of these studies, the application will be considered late, and an explanation from the sponsor will need to be provided. The key elements form should only include the essential details of the proposed pediatric plan, since these are binding and will be included in the compliance check during the procedure. Some examples of content to be included in the key elements form are details concerning the pediatric formulation, supportive non-clinical studies, details of the proposed pediatric studies, and plans for the modeling and simulation and extrapolation studies. Next slide, please. As required by the regulations, the pediatric planning process occurs much earlier in the EU than in the US. In the EU, the PIP should be submitted no later than the end of the healthy volunteer or PK studies. This can coincide with the initiation of the adult phase 2 proof of concept studies. It cannot be submitted after the initiation of the phase 3 pivotal or confirmatory trials. It is acknowledged that submitting a pediatric plan early in development can be challenging for sponsors, as the sponsor will likely have limited information on the overall product development plan. It is expected that the PIP will undergo multiple revisions during its development, and if the PIP is not submitted after completion of the initial PK studies, the submission will be considered late and should be noted as such by the sponsor. Submission of a UK PIP is similar to the EU requirement. A PIP produced specifically for Switzerland, referred to as a C8 PIP, is again fundamentally geared to the requirements of the EU, but is submitted along with the marketing application. In the US, submission is typically after the end of phase 2 meeting. Additional caveats in the event that there is no end of phase 2 meeting include submitting before phase 3 or the combination phase 2-3 studies begin. If there is no phase 3 or combination phase 2-3 study, the IPSP must be submitted at least 210 days prior to the NDA or the BLA filing. And FDA and EMA recommend that new PIPs and IPSPs for cancer products are submitted to their respective agencies simultaneously to promote global coordination and international research collaboration, as previously mentioned by them. Next slide, please. In the EU and the UK, applications are submitted in accordance to a published schedule. A key point to note here is that once the sponsor receives the day 60 opinion, the clock stops, and there is not a specified time frame for the sponsor to respond. I personally recommend that the sponsor plan to respond within about 3 months if possible. Once resubmitted, it again undergoes review with a final opinion provided at day 120. Prior to submission of the marketing application, the agency will validate whether the sponsor is compliant with the requirements outlined in the PIP. Next slide, please. In the US, the process follows a strict timeline. Although the application can be submitted at any time, once submitted, the sponsor is required to respond to FDA comments and reach agreement within 90 days. Otherwise, the application is considered not agreed. A sponsor must have an agreed plan to submit along with the application. Next slide, please. And in closing, just wanted to outline a few tips for preparing a successful pediatric plan. Some best practices are to allow adequate time to prepare the pediatric plan while utilizing the resources available, such as regulatory guidance and other information on both the EMA and FDA websites. It may be helpful to review opinions for other PIPs and post-marketing commitments for approved products. Ensure that all the necessary parties are represented on the pediatric team. Don't be afraid to ask questions. Reach out to external experts such as pediatricians and key opinion leaders who have expertise in the field. And be sure to maintain open communication with the regulators at EMA and FDA and take advantage of scientific advice. Thank you for your time and attention during this webinar. Now I'd like to turn it over to Suzanne.
Great. Thank you so much, Jackie, Lynn, and Amy, for that really excellent presentation. Got a time for a few questions from the audience. Someone wants to know, what happens if you don't come to an agreement on the PIP and you have to withdraw while your phase 3 study is ongoing?
Then it's going to be a matter of, if you have to withdraw and reconsider, then you're going to have to then resubmit, because you're not going to be able to file your marketing application without an agreed PIP in place.
Great, thank you, Lynn. Another question: when should we use population PK modeling, and when should we use Pvpk modeling?
Thank you, Suzanne. That would really depending on, first of all, the traditional approach is we can use population PK modeling up to maybe 1 month to 2 years old, but really depending on the mechanism of actions of the compound and also with the disease. But over time, if we need to consider the maturations of enzymes, for example, below 2 or below 1, we tend to also have physiological-based pharmacokinetic models as well.
Fantastic. Looks like we've got a question for Jackie. If you're submitting a PIP after phase 1 studies, or sorry, someone comments that submitting a PIP after phase 1 studies seems early and we only have very limited information. When do you recommend submitting the PIP, and how much information do we need to include in the document?
Great question. I would suggest reaching out to the EMA or PEDCO to confirm the amount of information that they would prefer, seek scientific advice prior to submitting your PIP, considering that you only have limited information available from your phase 1 studies. But you know, they will be able to provide key advice so that you are submitting in a timely fashion, and so that it is not late in the procedure.
Thanks, Jackie. Someone wants to know, is there flexibility in the PIP PSP deadlines if your phase 3 pivotal study is a pediatric study?
I'm sorry, Suzanne, can you repeat that one more time?
Is there flexibility in the PIP PSP timelines if your phase 3 pivotal study is a pediatric study?
Well, that likely that phase 3 study is going to be part of your PIP or your IPSP. So if there's changes to the timelines that are actually outlined, you can amend. You can go back and amend the PIP or IPSP if the timelines are substantially changed. So that is the process you'd follow.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Looks like we've got time for one last question. Can parallel scientific advice be submitted without having an active US IND?
You know what? I would think so, but I'd like to look into that further. I hadn't had that come up as an issue. But I mean, you know, like we look for other advice like in the pre-IND process. But if we could get back to whoever asked that question, Suzanne, I'd be happy to follow up.
Fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you so much to our speakers, Lynn, Amy, and Jackie, and thank you so much to RAPS for hosting us today. And now I'd like to pass it over to Lynn for a final slide before we close out.
So yes, I would like to thank everyone for attending. I did want to just mention that we, Certara, are hosting a pediatric symposium. This is our second annual symposium on pediatric drug development, new horizons in pediatric drug development. This is a free webinar, and certainly would encourage you to attend. It will be recorded as well, but we have a number of speakers coming from industry, academia, as well as health authorities, and it's really an informative meeting, so hope you can join us. Okay. So again, thank you for attending, and certainly if you have any further questions about today's presentations or questions about drug development, please feel free to contact me. Thank you so much and have a great day.